But onto our own country, which is also not always a bastion of human rights, there is a storm brewing down in Texas, shall we say. There's been some problems, and I want to be really clear. Like, Texas is a weird state. It's a red state, but it's a state that's turning really purple, and like it's kind of being seen increasingly as like potentially a swing state. And so I'm really fascinated by Republicans in Texas's total lack of self-awareness around some of the political calculations coming their way, because the things they're doing are just real wild. They've got this Republican governor right now, Governor Greg Abbott, and then they've got who I consider to be one of the worst attorney generals in the country, Ken Paxton. He's a hugely problematic attorney general, a huge enemy of criminal justice reform, and I just think basic human rights. He's also had his own like legal scandals and woes we won't get into here, but I can't stand Ken Paxton. I think he's awful. And it looks like the two of them have teamed up to do yet another really stupid thing recently.
Yeah, so what's going on is that the Texas state government, led by the AG Paxton and Governor Abbott, who you mentioned, they've basically issued a series of orders declaring that gender transition medical treatments, think puberty blockers, hormones, surgery, well, doing those things for minors is now going to be considered child abuse under Texas law. And I just want to preface this conversation with an acknowledgement that this is like a very nuanced and fraught issue. And I think there are very fair concerns that people can have about minors really being able to consent to some of this life-altering stuff that can make you infertile, it can make you never go through puberty. There's a lot at play here that I think is fair concerns. But as we're going to break down, this law kind of insanely goes too far and attacks parents in desperate situations. But just to get us, framed for this conversation, take a listen to some news coverage about this story from Straight Arrow News.
Putting parents behind bars. It's a move Texas Governor Greg Abbott is considering for those who have their children undergo gender-affirming procedures, saying it's a form of child abuse. In a letter, Abbott directed the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate any reported instances of these procedures. This includes reassignment surgeries as well as the use of puberty blockers. The letter came just a day after the state's attorney general also released a statement labeling these procedures as child abuse under Texas law. And it's not just the parents of the child that could be on the hook for future punishments. According to that letter, doctors, nurses, and teachers may also face criminal penalties for failing to report the labeled abuse.
So that kind of gives you the facts of what's going on here. And now let's listen to Hannah's favorite attorney general, who she thinks is super hot and based, describing
gross.
What he's doing here.
We did a lot of research. Our job is very simple. We're not making law. We're not interpreting. We were basically just exposing what the law is, and that's what we did. We spent my team spent literally hundreds of hours doing the research on this, and it's pretty clear in our laws, at least, that if you sterilize a child, whether it's through physical means or whether it's through some type of chemical means, that's child abuse in Texas, and it's wrong.
Hannah, your reaction to Daddy Paxton?
He makes me want to throw up, lick it all back up and throw it up again. That's how gross he is. Like, he is just bottom of the barrel, nasty human being. Can't stand it. I mean, I really do try to give a lot of people the benefit of the doubt, especially in politics. Like, you can have different policies than mine, but there are some people I'm just like, I think you're immoral and frankly evil, and I think he's in that category. Like, I cannot stand the way this man behaves. I think he's horrible. His policies are just really, really detrimental. And this is yet another one. And it goes back to like what I always say, being principled prevents many pitfalls. And if libertarians and conservatives are principled about this one thing, which is that the government should not be involved in healthcare, we never see these kinds of discussions come up, because the problem with this is it is extremely nuanced. And the bigger problem with this is it is nuanced, and it is somebody's personal health and has long-term repercussions in their life. This is one of the last things the government should be involved in deciding. I don't need to have any authority over what decisions you and your child and your doctor make. Period. that is between parents and doctors. Now, I can have my own opinions about what I would do were it my child in my household, and I do think one thing I am passionate about is like giving people better understandings of some of the long-term implications of these transitional policies or things that they're doing when the child is still very young. But all that being said, there is nothing in the world that will ever convince me government should be involved in this picture, and we certainly should not be getting to a point where the government is trying to criminalize those healthcare choices that are being made in a situation. And it's important to remember here, no matter where you are on trans issues, that this will come for you too. If you stand by this kind of precedent of them being able to come in and make you a criminal for decisions you make about your child's health care, don't be surprised when you end up going to jail because you didn't vaccinate your child. Okay? These decisions will come for you too. So you better learn to be a trans activist in this regard, because it will not stop there. It's a really very, very unbased policy. It has nothing to do with limiting the government or individual liberty. It's nothing we should ever see in the United States. I'm horrified by it.
So I'm with you absolutely on why this one is so problematic. I think I'm in a different place than you, though, on this issue a little more broadly, in that I think things like a sex change or medical hormones or these kinds of things can leave a young person infertile. They can basically leave their body irreversibly transformed, which is the point if they're trans. But if they end up desisting and not being trans, which does happen to a number of people, then they're permanently disfigured and scarred. And so I can understand, I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I can understand the notion that the government should require young people to be the age of consent before they can do this kind of thing, before they can make this decision about their body, and that would be in the form of regulating healthcare providers. I think that at least we could have a conversation about, and maybe there's a reasonable point of view there. What offends me so deeply about this is that labeling it child abuse means that you are criminally going after parents and doctors, criminally, not just regulatorily. And you're basically going to break up families. If you charge someone with child abuse, I mean, you're saying that the state should take away their children, and you should break up the families, which is coming from, of course, the pro-family Republicans over here. And I find that so horribly offensive on this issue, because even if you think it's a mistake to put children through these irreversible surgeries at a young age, it is still requires empathy and compassion for what these parents are going through. Just imagine for a second that you're a parent who has a child with gender dysphoria, who is deeply confused about their gender, and they come to you and they tell you about it. They're having anxiety and depression because of it, and you go and you take them to a doctor. The doctor tells you what should be done is putting them on puberty blockers and cross-hormone therapies. The psychiatrist agrees. The medical experts are telling you this is what's best for your child, and you are desperately scared of losing that child to suicide, because there are very high rates of suicide for transgender youth, especially when they're not affirmed. Though we're not quite clear on whether these surgeries successfully reduce the rates of suicide. There's some debate about that emerging. But anyway, the doctors are telling these parents this could save your kid's life. And all they're doing is in the best interest of their child, listening to what medical experts are telling them might save their kid's life. And you're going to come here and call them child abusers? I think that is vile. I think it lacks any empathy, any compassion for the situation that these people are in. And I think it's just totally beyond the pale and a horrible precedent, like you said.
Yeah, I think that's that's really good input, because I do not know as much about these issues, right? I haven't walked this walk. I'm not really intimately familiar with it. I have heard some pushback from people who say, like, if you don't allow them to at least begin some part of the transitioning process, like before puberty, that like it can be harder for them to do that later in life, which I think is a valid concern. But to my understanding,
yes, it is. That's the trade-off.
There are like puberty blockers, though, right? Where like you could stay on that and then make the final decision a little bit later. Is that right?
So puberty blockers are what would be given at age 10, 11, 12 for a girl, maybe a little later for a boy. They essentially prevent puberty, and then when they're a little older, 14, 15, 16, they can start the hormone therapies and go through puberty for the opposite sex. And what that allows is essentially a more effective transition. But the problem, the reason that that's a problem is that before they started doing this, lots of kids who were gender confused or experiencing gender dysphoria would, for a lack of a better word, grow out of it. And we don't have good data on how many, but a large portion, possibly a majority, would end up kind of reconciling with their birth sex, and many would actually become butch lesbian women or effeminate gay men. And that's fine, that should be fine. But once you put them on the medical path and you block them from going through puberty, it all but eliminates the chance that they're going to kind of reconcile with their birth sex, which is what the traditional approach of kind of watchful waiting recommended. But it's hard because if you do wait and they go through puberty as their birth sex, you will never be able, without very expensive plastic surgeries, be able to replicate the transition as effectively. Now, that is a big trade-off because it has a big impact on those people's quality of life and their mental health. But if the other, on the opposite side of the coin, is being able to consent to things at such a young age that I did not understand my sex or sexuality in any meaningful sense at age 11 or 12 to make life-altering decisions about my body. And so it's very complicated and it's very nuanced, the details of this. And that's part of why I think it's particularly terrible to condemn people who've made a tough decision in a terrible situation for their family. They're worried about losing their child's life to suicide as child abusers just because they didn't come down on the side that you think is correct, when this is so nuanced and fraught, in my opinion.
Yeah, this whole discussion just kind of reaffirms what I was sort of saying at the beginning, which is that I think education's needed, and I think we should really do what we can to emphasize like people getting all this information up front so they really can weigh the calculations they're making. But I still think it should be up to the parents and the child and the doctor. Like those are lifelong decisions that really like aren't totally reversible and like have real implications. Like those kinds of nuanced decisions are the last thing I ever want government involved in, because they are complicated and they're hard and they come down to a million different calculations individuals have to make. So I just think it's a horrible law. I think that this is, I don't know, this kind of activity policy just feels like the republicanism that's dying out. It's like, it's so antiquated. It's not something that's going to continue to like captivate audiences or really get people on your side. Like most people don't want to see big government involved in people's daily decisions like this. So I think it's really missing the mark, and I hope they get a lot of backlash for it, honestly.
Yeah, I hope so too, but I think you might be being a little optimistic. I think at least in the hardcore GOP base, there is some appreciation for this kind of thing because it's essentially seen, not that they actually know kids who are being, rushed through surgeries or anything. For most people, this is the kind of thing they only experience, similar to CRT in schools, which derivatives of CRT are taught in some schools, very woke, far-left ideas, but it's not super common. So most people's exposure to it is what they see on TV or on the internet. It's not like they're experiencing this in their communities and they're mad about it. I would say the same is probably true here. There's a very famous case in Texas of James Younger, who identified as a girl. I would say the girl name, I honestly just don't remember it, and was, the father was fighting against it, and there was some reason to believe the mother was pressuring the child to transition, and he was really young too, and it was this whole fraught case that caught the culture war imagination and fired people up. And so I think there's probably political demand for this at the base grassroots level in a certain faction of that hardcore Republican MAGA base. But I agree with you that this is the kind of thing that is, I think, very off-putting to people in the middle or to young people who are, center-right and sympathetic to a lot of traditionally conservative or libertarian ideals. But then they're like, these are nanny state Karen Republicans who want to micromanage our families and our social lives. How can they claim to actually believe in freedom on things like COVID where we actually want that? I mean, it's really an issue where I think they're caving to a base at the expense of reasonable and empathetic policy and of mainstream appeal.